What exactly is your own personal criteria for an all-time great? I don't think there's an answer out there that gets unanimous approval, but through this series, I want to help in outlining the argument for 7 different fighters as MMA's undisputed GOAT. Anderson Silva, Khabib Nurmagomedov, Amanda Nunes, George St-Pierre, Fedor Emelianenko, Demetrious Johnson, and Jon Jones. I won't try to deny it. These 7 fighters are not all on the same level, but each certainly has something that has established them as a cut above all others, within their respective divisions and eras. Everything else is a matter of preference. Week by week, I'll take one of these fighters, breaking down their unique claim to the throne, dropping some insight on where that claim might be hindered, before leaving the actual decision-making up to you guys. I think it'll be an interesting and enjoyable dip into one of the sport's most ever-present topics, and between myself and you guys, our loyal viewers, we're gonna try and get as close as possible to finding MMA's GOAT. So after we had a bit of a hiatus from this series due to us being completely and utterly saturated with gloriously entertaining MMA over the last 3 weeks, I was definitely looking forward to diving back into the GOAT argument with an episode centered around a figure who is as fresh in our minds right now as any fighter in the game. But I think just before we get into this GOAT candidates conversation, I'll point out that this isn't a topical discussion about the personal problems and major controversies that currently surround Jon Jones. We actually have another video that gets into that, so check that out after this. Instead, just like I've done with Anderson Silva, Khabib Nurmagomedov, Amanda Nunes, and George St-Pierre, this is a video that will serve as an outline of this longtime light heavyweight champion's claim to that throne, meaning the title of greatest of all time, and where that argument's strengths and weaknesses lie. So let's just get into it. Out of all of the fighters this series is based upon, I'd argue that none of their respective rises were anything quite like the ascent of Jon Jones. Anderson Silva was the polished striker and submission threat who became a greater and greater version of himself as the years went on, eventually perfecting his approach to the point where he could summon moments of magic unlike anything we'd ever seen, without a second's worth of notice. Nurmagomedov was kind of similar in that regard. We knew what he was when he debuted in the UFC, and like Anderson, he went on to perfect his approach, bringing it further than anyone could have ever imagined. I think you can look at George St-Pierre as kind of an outlier to that, as he developed formidable striking and the best wrestling game at welterweight, as a member of a division full of legitimate wrestling greats, and he did this without a background, collegiately, using his talents as a total natural and a scarily good athlete to eventually go on to beat guys like John Fitch, Josh Koscheck, and Matt Hughes at their own game. But the roadmap for what GSP would eventually be known for was still kind of there in front of our eyes as it evolved. I'd argue that Jon Jones came into the sport, and with the passing of each one of his earliest fights, he forced us to reassess our thinking on who he was, and who he actually could eventually become. I'd recommend to any MMA fan, regardless of your interest level, to just go back and revisit Jon Jones's career, either in its entirety or at least his road to UFC gold, maybe adding in the first few defenses if you have the time. Those first pre-UFC fights showed a fighter that was clearly athletic as hell, gifted in Greco-Roman wrestling, and above all other things, totally fearless in there. And it's not that all other fighters have a fear that Jon Jones doesn't, but there is a certain confidence and arrogance even to the way that Jon fought in those early fights, the way he wanted to show us his improvements, how he clearly strove to make us reassess where we saw his ceiling. He went out there against Andre Guzmão in his UFC debut and he was green as hell, giving us a completely unrefined display of the MMA skill set that showed a fighter who looked like he was just trying to get comfortable, more than anything else. It wasn't even an outstanding debut, but there was an unmistakable attitude to him, an attitude that would define his best moments in the sport. When he returned for a second time to take on Stephan Bonnar, he brought new weapons with him to the cage, including an incredible spinning elbow that would really drag a lot of the sport's attention towards him. Indeed, his dynamic wrestling and all of that explosiveness was a major part of his first few fights, but we started to see this guy reshaping himself as a bit of a wild man. He didn't move like these other light heavyweights, and over the next few years, his wide range of striking tools really began to baffle his opponents. Everything about Jon Jones during these opening few fights was flashy. It was explosive. It was almost as if he was determined to let everyone watching know just how goddamn athletic he was. And the crazy thing was that all of this excess actually worked perfectly in his pursuit of dominance. He wasn't needlessly throwing silly techniques or wasting energy. What I'm trying to say is that Jon Jones was giving us displays that were honest, clear portraits of who he was and who he would continue to be, a reckless but truly brilliant competitor. And over the next 10 or so years, he would amass a collection of names on his resume that can only be challenged by GSP in terms of prestige. And I think when we're talking about the GOAT conversation, the sheer weight of his record is definitely one of his strongest arguments. He beat everybody he ever faced. And the guys who people maybe think edged him out, Alexander Gustafsson, Dominic Reyes, Thiago Santos, none of them could find any form of definitive victory. No matter which way you scored them, those were razor close fights. I actually scored the Dominic Reyes fight against John on the night, but my subsequent rewatches made it a bit less clear. In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter though. The only fighter who has ever had a run of dominance that was better than Jon Jones in terms of the levels it reached was of course Khabib Nurmagomedov, but he didn't sustain that for anywhere near as long as Jon did. Jones's resume is just ridiculous, to be honest. He beat guys who were already established in the sport. Vitor Belfort, Shogun Rua, Rampage Jackson, Lyoto Machida, Rashad Evans. He beat his contemporaries, Ryan Bader, Alexander Gustafsson, Glover Teixeira, and of course his most noteworthy opponent, Daniel Cormier. And he did it all with a level of offensive and defensive savvy that saw him barely troubled in terms of damage sustained. I'd argue that Jones might have the best defense in MMA history, in every sense of the word, whether in terms of striking, grappling, or wrestling. And his arsenal of weapons, though he definitely is a lot more reserved nowadays, is still among the most diverse we've ever seen. Coming in as a Greco-Roman wrestler and not a striker, and according to his coaches, he was basically learning techniques off YouTube. Yeah, it just shows what a natural he was. So what exactly are the downsides to his claim? Well, there are certainly a few of them, and they're not really too clear-cut. The whole performance-enhancing drugs allegations and frequent issues with USADA will likely be a major turnoff to a lot of you. No matter where you stand on how guilty Jones is, the sheer number of incidents is definitely a cause for concern if that's something that impacts your GOAT decision-making process. I know some people have raised the point that some of Jones's opponents were more natural middleweights, the likes of Vitor, Machida, Rashad, and Chael Sonnen, guys who would eventually find their way down to 185 pounds for an extended period. And though I have my own thoughts on a lot of the revisionism that a lot of fans are into these days, I'll just add the point that it was a different time, and a lot of fighters weren't as driven to fight at their perfect natural weight as they are nowadays. Look at Frankie Edgar 20 pounds up at lightweight, Vanderlei Silva and Rashad Evans at heavyweight, etc, etc, etc. It could also be said that 205 pounds hasn't always been the strongest division, even if a dominant champion can sometimes make a weight class look like that. But for sure, there's definitely an argument to be made about how long it took for fresh contenders, exciting new talents to emerge at light heavyweight, something that the heavyweight division was also hit with for years. Often Jones is criticized, especially on his more recent run, for fighting to the judges, because he's just so in tune with the point scoring requirements that would eventually decide the fight. Major examples being the Anthony Smith and Ovince St. Preux fights. He's a fighter who is acutely aware of the scoring criteria, and in his later years, some might have found it annoying or even underwhelming that he has been more of a points fighter. And obviously the elephant in the room is his constant use of eye pokes, a result of his fighting style and his 84-inch reach. And yeah, in a world where all fighters should be the best and most noble versions of themselves possible, Jon probably should adapt his style. But like we've seen with Yoel Romero on so many occasions, if the incentive is there to bend the rules and the consequences just aren't, certain guys are always going to take advantage. And if you know anything about Jon Jones, the man, you'll know he's not overly concerned with what anyone thinks about him. So yeah, like all of the other candidates in this series, there are some shortcomings, but with a UFC record of 20 wins, one frankly ridiculous loss to Matt Hamill, and of course his TKO that was later declared a no contest against DC, Jon has managed to amass a frankly ridiculous level of consistency over the course of his 22 UFC outings. 14 wins in UFC title fights, counting his interim championship win over OSP, but not counting his TKO of Cormier. He's never been dropped, he's never really been properly stunned, he's been taken down just a handful of times, and though his argument has a lot of very unique drawbacks that will turn a lot of you off of his GOAT claim, I personally just want to see him at heavyweight before he retires, or gets locked up in a jail cell or whatever happens to him. Jon Jones, above all other candidates, has the chance to make his claim at GOAT status beyond watertight if he is successful in capturing UFC heavyweight gold, earning a title in the sport's most historically significant and risky division. And with Francis Ngannou and Cyril Gane looking set to compete for the heavyweight strap, I'd argue that there's not a more interesting time for this potential super fight to happen. That is, if Jones can keep it together. So yeah, the Jon Jones episode was always going to be a weird one. The man has done so much over the course of his rise and overall progression that it is very difficult to actually paint a vivid picture of why he is so special. Just like he's so problematic as a GOAT conversation candidate that it's kind of tough to really establish the middle ground. But do let us know what you think about Jon Jones's claim in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to check out the other entries to the series before subscribing to the channel so you can stay up to date with all of our latest uploads. Thank you for watching.